A man who owned everything, almost drove past two children who had nothing. But what he saw in their eyes that day would break him, remake him, and force him to face a truth money could never buy. Because sometimes, the moment you choose to ignore someone's pain becomes the moment that defines your entire life. And what happened next, no one could have predicted. If stories about love, sacrifice, and second chances mean something to you, take a second to subscribe. Because this one stays with you. The Texas sun burned like fire that afternoon, stretching across an endless highway just outside San Antonio. The road looked empty, lifeless, the kind of place where nothing ever changed. Richard Hale liked it that way. Inside his sleek, black luxury convertible, the world felt controlled, predictable. The air conditioning was perfect, his suit untouched by dust, his schedule packed down to the minute. A rich man's life, clean, efficient, untouched by chaos. He gripped the steering wheel, his jaw tight, eyes fixed straight ahead. Then something broke the pattern. At first, it was just a flicker in the distance. A shape that didn't belong. He almost ignored it. But something strange, something uncomfortable, pressed against his chest. And before he could explain why, his foot hit the brake. The car slowed. Then stopped. Richard exhaled sharply, annoyed at himself more than anything. "This isn't your problem," he muttered under his breath. But he still looked. Two children, sitting by the side of the road. A boy and a girl, no older than 10 and 7. Dust clung to their clothes, their faces tired in a way no child should ever look. A worn suitcase sat beside them, along with a faded duffel bag that looked like it had been dragged across miles of dirt. The boy had his arm wrapped around the girl, holding her close, protecting her. The girl clutched a torn teddy bear to her chest like it was the only thing left in her world. Richard stared. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then, with a quiet click, the engine shut off. He stepped out of the car, the heat hitting him instantly, clinging to his expensive clothes like it didn't belong there. The boy noticed him first. His eyes were sharp, careful, like he'd learned too early how the world really works. The girl pressed closer to him. Richard walked up, slow, measured. "You kids lost?" he asked, his tone flat, almost cold. The boy shook his head after a pause. "No, sir." Richard frowned slightly. "Then what are you doing out here?" The boy took a breath, like choosing his words carefully. "We're waiting for our mom." Something in his voice made Richard stop. "In the middle of nowhere?" he asked. The boy nodded. "We got evicted this morning. The landlord didn't want to wait anymore." His grip tightened slightly around his sister. "Mom told us to stay here. She went back to the house to get some important papers. She said she'd be right back." Richard's expression didn't change, but something inside him shifted. "How long ago was that?" The boy looked up at the sky, squinting against the sun. "I think 3 hours." 3 hours. In this heat. Richard glanced around. No shade. No water. Nothing. The girl finally looked up, her voice small but steady. "She's coming back." That certainty hit harder than anything else. Richard crossed his arms. "And you've just been sitting here?" "The whole time." "Yes, sir," the boy said. "She told us not to move." There was no anger in his voice. No panic. Just belief. Richard swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. "Have you eaten today?" The boy hesitated, then shook his head. The girl hugged her teddy tighter. "We didn't want to spend the money," she whispered. "Mom said we need every penny." Richard looked at them, really looked this time. Less than an hour ago, he'd been sitting in a private dining room, sending back a steak because it wasn't cooked right. Now 2 kids were starving, because they were afraid to lose a few dollars. "What are your names?" he asked quietly. "I'm Luke," the boy said. "And this is my sister, Isabella." Isabella gave a small, shy wave. Richard nodded slowly. "I'm Richard." For a second, he turned his head, glancing back at his car. He could leave. Drive away. Forget this ever happened. That was the life he knew. The life he'd always lived. No complications. No attachments. Just clean exits. But then, "Do you know what time it is, sir?" Luke asked. Richard checked his watch. "Almost 4. Luke nodded, a faint hint of relief crossing his face. "Then she should be coming over that hill any minute now." Richard looked at the empty road. There was no one there. No movement. No sign of anyone coming. And yet, the boy believed it completely. That belief cracked something open inside him. Richard ran a hand over his face, frustrated. "Where's your house?" Luke pointed down the road. "About 15 minutes that way. Small place. Blue gate." Richard followed his finger, then looked back at the two kids. At their dusty clothes. Their empty hands. Their quiet hope. He exhaled slowly. "Get in the car," he said. Luke blinked. "Sir." "I'm not leaving you out here," Richard said, more firmly this time. "I'll drive you there." Isabella's eyes widened. "Really?" Richard opened the passenger door. "Yeah, really." The girl climbed in carefully, like she was afraid she might break something just by touching it. Luke followed, holding the suitcase, still watching Richard like he wasn't sure if this was real. As the engine roared back to life, cold air filling the car, Richard felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not annoyance. Not control. Something heavier. Something real. "Show me the way," he said. Luke nodded, leaning forward. And as the car pulled away from the empty highway, Richard had no idea that this single decision was about to change everything. But what he didn't know yet was that the truth waiting at that blue gate would hit harder than anything he'd ever faced before. The car moved steadily down the road, leaving behind the empty stretch of highway and heading into a part of the city Richard had never really paid attention to. Luke guided him quietly, pointing left, then right, his voice calm but tense beneath the surface. Isabella sat still in the front seat, her small hands resting on the teddy bear, her eyes fixed on the road ahead like she was waiting for a miracle to appear. Richard noticed how neither of them touched anything inside the car. Not the buttons, not the leather seats, not even the window. Like they didn't feel like they belonged there. "Turn here," Luke said softly. The scenery changed fast. Wide roads turned narrow. Clean buildings gave way to worn-down houses. Paint peeled off the walls, fences leaned sideways, and silence hung heavier here, not peaceful, but tired. Richard slowed the car. "This is it," Luke said, pointing ahead. Richard followed his gaze. A small house stood at the end of the street. The blue gate. But it was open. And something about that didn't feel right. Richard pulled the car to a stop. Before the engine even fully quieted, Luke pushed the door open and jumped out. "Mom!" he shouted, already running. Isabella scrambled out right after him, her little legs struggling to keep up. "Mommy!" she cried. Richard stepped out more slowly. A strange weight pressed down on his chest. The front door of the house was closed, and across it, a bright strip of red eviction tape. It cut across the door like a final sentence. Richard's eyes narrowed. This wasn't just eviction. Something else had happened here. Luke reached the gate first, pushing it open wider, running straight toward the door. "Mom!" he shouted again, knocking hard. No answer. Isabella stood behind him, clutching her teddy, her voice trembling. "Mommy, we're here." The silence that followed felt louder than anything. Richard looked around. Across the street, two older neighbors stood near a fence, watching. One of them, a woman with tired eyes, suddenly stepped forward. Oh my goodness," she said, hurrying toward the children. "You're Patricia's kids, aren't you?" Luke turned quickly. "Yes. Did you see our mom? Is she inside?" The woman froze for a moment. And in that moment, Richard felt it. That shift. That quiet, heavy pause that always comes before bad news. The woman pressed her hand against her chest. "Oh, sweetheart." Luke's face tightened. What happened? Richard stepped closer now, standing just behind them without thinking. The woman swallowed. "Your mother. She got very sick earlier today. She was inside the house when it happened. She collapsed. Everything went still. My husband heard the noise," she continued softly. "He ran over and called an ambulance. They took her to the hospital about 2 hours ago." Isabella's face went blank. Then it broke. "Is my mommy sick?" she cried, her voice shaking. "Is she gonna go away?" No, the woman said quickly, crouching down. "She just fainted, sweetheart. But she looked very weak." Luke didn't move. He just stood there, frozen. All the strength he had been holding together cracked in silence. Richard felt something twist inside his chest. Harder this time. Sharper. "Which hospital?" Richard asked, his voice firm. The woman looked up at him. "The Central Hospital downtown." Richard nodded once. Then he placed his hand gently on Luke's shoulder. "Get back in the car." Luke didn't react at first. Then slowly, he looked up. His eyes were no longer steady. They were breaking. You're really gonna take us?" he asked, his voice barely holding together. "Yes," Richard said. No hesitation. No distance. Just certainty. Luke grabbed Isabella's hand. "Come on," he whispered. They ran back toward the car. This time, they didn't hesitate before getting in. This time, they needed him. Richard slid into the driver's seat, his grip tightening around the wheel. For the first time in his life, he didn't care about his schedule. He didn't care about where he was supposed to be. He just pressed the gas. The car surged forward. Inside, the air felt heavier than before. Isabella's quiet sobs filled the silence. Luke held her close, his own tears slipping down without a sound. Richard stared straight ahead. And for the first time, he felt something he couldn't control. Helpless. He had built his entire life around control. Money solved problems. Power removed obstacles. But this wasn't something he could fix with a phone call. This wasn't a business deal. This was a family. Breaking. The hospital building came into view, tall and cold against the sky. Richard pulled up fast, stopping right at the entrance. "Let's go," he said. Luke was already out of the car, pulling Isabella along. Richard followed right behind them. Inside, the air smelled sterile, sharp, unfamiliar. They rushed to the reception desk. "Our mom, Patricia," Luke said quickly. "She was brought here today." The nurse typed fast, scanning the screen. Then she nodded. "Yes, she's here. She's in observation." Relief flickered across Luke's face. But it didn't last long. "Can we see her?" he asked. The nurse hesitated slightly. Then her eyes shifted to Richard. "And you are?" Richard didn't pause. "I'm responsible for them," he said calmly. The nurse studied him for a second. Then nodded. "A doctor will speak to you shortly." Luke sat down heavily in a chair, burying his face in his hands. Isabella climbed beside him, curling into his side. Richard remained standing, watching, waiting. For the first time, he didn't know what came next, and that feeling was louder than anything. The seconds stretched. The clock on the wall ticked, each sound hitting harder than the last. Then suddenly, the doors opened. A doctor stepped out, scanning the room. "Family of Patricia?" he called. Luke shot to his feet instantly. "That's us." The doctor's eyes moved from the children to Richard, and something in his expression changed. Not relief, not calm, something more serious. And in that moment, Richard knew. Whatever the doctor was about to say was about to change everything again. The doctor took a few slow steps toward them, his expression careful, measured, like he was choosing every word before it left his mouth. Luke stood stiff, his small hand tightening around Isabella's fingers. "Is she okay?" Luke asked quickly, his voice sharp with fear. "Please, just tell me if she's okay." The doctor nodded once. "Your mother is alive." A breath escaped Luke's chest, shaky, uneven. Isabella pressed closer to him, her grip tightening on her teddy bear. "But," the doctor continued, and that single word froze the air around them, "she experienced a severe episode caused by extreme exhaustion and stress." Richard's jaw tightened. The doctor crouched slightly, lowering himself closer to the children's level. Her body was pushed too far. She collapsed, and for a short time, her brain didn't get enough oxygen. Luke's eyes widened. "What does that mean?" The doctor hesitated, and that hesitation said everything. "It means," he said gently, "that she's stable right now, but there's a complication." Isabella shook her head immediately, as if refusing to hear it. No, she's okay. She's gonna come back, right?" The doctor looked at her with quiet sympathy. "She's going to recover physically." Luke stepped forward. "Then what's wrong?" The doctor took a slow breath. "She's experiencing temporary memory loss." The words didn't land right away. They just hung there. "What kind of memory loss?" Luke asked, his voice dropping. "She may not recognize certain people," the doctor explained. "Important parts of her life could feel blank to her right now. In many cases, memory comes back over time. But for now—" He paused. "She might not remember you." Silence. Complete, suffocating silence. Isabella's face crumpled instantly. "No," she whispered, shaking her head harder. "No, that's not true. She knows me. I'm her baby." Luke didn't speak. He just stood there, staring at the floor, his breathing slow, heavy, like he was trying to hold something inside that was about to break loose. Richard felt it again. That pressure in his chest. Stronger now. "Can we see her?" Luke asked finally, his voice barely steady. The doctor nodded. "You can. But you need to be gentle. Don't overwhelm her." Luke gave a small, stiff nod. Isabella wiped her tears with the back of her hand, clutching her teddy tighter like it could somehow fix everything. Richard didn't say a word. He just followed them. The hallway felt longer than it should have. Each step echoing. Each second stretching. Room 3. The doctor stopped at the door and pushed it open slowly. Inside, Patricia lay on the hospital bed, her face pale, her body still. For a moment, she didn't move. Then slowly, she turned her head. Her eyes opened. Luke stepped forward first. "Mom," he said softly. Her gaze landed on him. Then shifted to Isabella. Then to Richard. There was no warmth. No recognition. Just confusion. "Who are you?" she asked quietly. The words hit like a punch. Isabella let out a broken cry. "Mommy, it's me!" She rushed forward, tears falling fast. "It's me, Isabella." Patricia's expression didn't change. Luke stepped closer, his voice trembling despite everything he tried to hold together. "It's me, Mom. I'm Luke. We came back, just like you said." Patricia closed her eyes for a moment, like she was trying to force something to appear. But nothing came. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I don't remember." Isabella shook her head, crying harder now. You do remember. You always call me your little Ivy. You remember that, right?" Patricia looked at her. Really looked. And something flickered. Not memory. Not recognition. But something deeper. "I can feel," she said slowly, her voice fragile, "that you matter to me." Isabella's sobs filled the room. Luke turned his face slightly, his eyes squeezing shut, fighting against tears that refused to stay back. Richard stood near the doorway. Frozen. He had never seen pain like this before. Not the kind money could fix. Not the kind that came with a solution. This was something else. Something raw. Something real. A nurse stepped forward gently. "She needs rest," she said softly. "You can stay a few more minutes." Luke nodded without looking. Isabella moved closer to the bed, placing her small hand over Patricia's fingers. "Please don't forget us," she whispered. Patricia squeezed her hand weakly. "I don't see your faces in my mind," she said, her voice breaking. "But my heart, it's telling me I should." Richard couldn't stay. He turned and stepped out into the hallway. The door closed softly behind him. He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. This wasn't supposed to happen. None of this was supposed to be his problem. But now, it was. 10 minutes later, the door opened again. Luke walked out, holding Isabella's hand. She looked completely shattered, like something inside her had been taken away. Luke stopped in front of Richard. For a second, he didn't speak. Then quietly, "What do we do now?" he asked. Not as a question, but as something deeper. Like he had reached the end of what he could carry alone. Richard looked at them. Really looked. Two kids who had lost everything in a single day. Their home. Their safety. And now, even their mother's memory. Something inside him shifted again. This time, it didn't hesitate. "You're not going to be alone," he said. Luke frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Richard took a slow breath. "You're coming with me." Silence fell between them. Isabella looked up, her eyes red, her voice small. "To where?" Richard held their gaze. "To my home." Luke blinked, unsure. "For how long?" Richard didn't look away. "For as long as you need." The words hung there, heavy, real. And in that moment, Luke wasn't just looking at a rich stranger anymore. He was looking at someone making a promise. And he didn't know yet just how much that promise was about to change all of their lives. Luke didn't answer right away. He just looked at Richard, searching his face, like he was trying to figure out if this was real, or just another moment that would fall apart. "We don't have anywhere else," Luke said quietly, almost to himself. Isabella tugged gently at his sleeve. "Luke, I don't want to go back to the road." That was it. That was all it took. Luke gave a small nod. "Okay," he said, his voice steady but tired. "We'll come with you." Richard didn't say anything more. He simply turned and started walking toward the exit, trusting they would follow. And they did. Outside, the air felt cooler now, the sun beginning to drop, stretching long shadows across the ground. The day had taken something out of all of them. The car sat waiting. This time, when Isabella climbed in, she didn't hesitate as much. She still moved carefully, but she leaned back slightly into the seat, like she was allowing herself, just a little, to feel safe. Luke sat beside her in the back, his arm immediately wrapping around her again. Richard got into the driver's seat. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the engine started. The drive was quiet. Not empty, just heavy. Isabella rested her head against Luke's shoulder, her eyes half closed, still clutching her teddy bear like it was the only familiar thing left in her world. "Richard," she said softly after a while. He glanced at her through the mirror. "Yeah. Is your house big?" The question caught him off guard. "Yeah," he admitted. She nodded slowly. "Okay." A pause. "Are we gonna get in trouble for being there?" Richard's hands tightened slightly on the wheel. "No," he said. "You're not gonna get in trouble." Luke shifted slightly. "What about your family?" Richard didn't answer right away. That question carried more weight than Luke realized. "They'll deal with it," Richard said finally. The rest of the drive passed in silence. But outside the windows, the world began to change again. The broken streets disappeared. The small houses faded. Wide roads returned. Clean sidewalks. Tall gates. Perfect lawns that looked like no one had ever struggled there. Not even once. Luke noticed it immediately. "You live here?" he asked, his voice low with disbelief. "Yeah." The car slowed as it approached massive iron gates. They stood tall, unshakable, like a barrier between two completely different worlds. Richard pressed a button. The gates opened smoothly. And just like that, they crossed over. The driveway stretched long and curved, leading up to a mansion that didn't even look real under the fading sunlight. Isabella sat up straight. Her eyes widened. "Luke," she whispered. "This looks like one of those houses on TV." Luke didn't respond. He just stared, trying to understand how a place like this could even exist. The car came to a stop in front of large wooden doors. For a second, no one moved. Then Richard stepped out. "You can come," he said, walking toward the entrance. Luke opened the door carefully, stepping out like he wasn't sure the ground here was meant for him. Isabella followed, holding his hand tightly. Before Richard could reach the door, it opened. A woman stepped out, dressed neatly, her posture straight and composed. She froze the moment she saw the children. Her eyes dropped to their dusty shoes, their worn clothes. Isabella's teddy bear. Then back to Richard. "Mr. Richard," she said slowly. "Who are these children?" "They're staying here," Richard replied simply. The woman blinked, clearly caught off guard. But she didn't question him further. Instead, her expression softened. "Well, then they're welcome," she said gently. She stepped aside, opening the door wider. "Come in." Luke hesitated. Isabella looked up at him. "Are we allowed?" Richard glanced back. "Yeah, you are." That was enough. They stepped inside. The moment their feet touched the marble floor, everything changed. The space was enormous. Light reflected off polished surfaces, a chandelier hanging above like something out of a dream. Isabella stopped walking. Her small voice echoed slightly. "Luke, I don't think we should touch anything." The woman smiled softly, crouching down to their level. "You don't have to worry about that, sweetheart." She looked at them kindly. "What are your names?" "I'm Luke," he said, still a little guarded. "And I'm Isabella." "It's nice to meet you both," she said warmly. "My name is Valerie." Isabella looked at her apron. "We won't make anything dirty. I promise." Valerie's expression shifted, something emotional passing through her eyes. "Oh, honey," she said gently, placing a hand on Isabella's shoulder. "You don't need to worry about things like that here." Richard stepped forward. "Their mother is in the hospital. She collapsed." She lost her memory. Valerie's hand moved to her mouth. Oh my! Isabella's lip trembled again. Without thinking, Valerie pulled her into a gentle hug. It's going to be okay, she whispered. Luke stood still, watching. Not used to this kind of kindness. Not used to people caring without asking for something in return. Can you prepare a room for them? Richard asked. Of course, Valerie nodded immediately. Luke spoke up. Can we stay in the same room? Richard didn't hesitate. Yes. Valerie smiled. Come with me. As she led them toward the stairs, Isabella looked back at Richard. Thank you, she said softly. The words landed heavier than expected. Richard gave a small nod. Then they disappeared upstairs. And for the first time since the day began, the house went quiet. Richard stood alone in the center of it all. The same house he had lived in for years. But somehow, it didn't feel the same anymore. A sharp sound broke the silence. Footsteps. Slow. Controlled. Familiar. Richard turned. A tall man stood at the far end of the room, his presence filling the space without effort. His eyes moved from the staircase to Richard. What exactly, his father said calmly, did you just bring into my house? The air shifted instantly. And Richard knew. This was the moment where everything could either fall apart, or begin something even bigger than he expected. Richard didn't look away. He held his father's gaze, steady, calm, but something deeper had changed behind his eyes. They're kids, he said simply. They had nowhere else to go. His father stepped forward slowly, the sound of his shoes echoing across the marble floor. That was not my question, he replied, his voice controlled, but sharp beneath the surface. I asked what you brought into my house. Richard exhaled quietly. I brought in 2 children who were left on the side of the road. They got evicted. Their mother collapsed. She's in the hospital right now. His father's expression didn't soften. If anything, it became more focused. And your solution, he said, was to bring them here? Yes. Silence stretched between them. Not empty silence. Heavy silence. The kind that carried judgment. You don't know who they are, his father continued. You don't know their background, their situation, their risks. You've just invited strangers into this house like it's nothing. They're not a risk, Richard said firmly. His father's eyes narrowed slightly. And you're certain of that? Richard paused. For a moment, the old version of him would have answered differently. He would have agreed. Would have backed down. Would have chosen comfort over conflict. But not now. They're scared, Richard said instead. They're alone. And they didn't ask for any of this. His father studied him carefully. You've never cared about things like that before. The words weren't angry. They were curious. And that made them hit harder. Richard swallowed. I know, he said quietly. Another step forward. Then explain it to me, his father said. What changed? Richard looked toward the staircase for a brief second, like he could still see them there. Luke, trying to act strong. Isabella, holding on to that teddy bear like it was the only thing keeping her together. He looked back. I saw them sitting on the side of the road, Richard said slowly. No food. No water. Just waiting. Waiting for what? For their mother. A pause. They believed she was coming back, Richard added, his voice softer now. Even after hours in that heat, they still believed it. His father didn't interrupt. Richard continued, something building behind his words now. They had nothing, he said. No home. No safety. No guarantees. But they still had faith. He let out a small breath. And I realized, I have everything, and I've never believed in anything like that. The room fell quiet again. But this time, it felt different. Not tense. Not confrontational. Something else. His father's expression shifted slightly, the edge softening just enough to notice. "You're telling me," he said slowly, "that 2 children sitting on a road made you question your entire life?" Richard didn't hesitate. Yes. That answer hung in the air. Simple, honest, and impossible to ignore. His father turned slightly, walking a few steps away, his hands clasped behind his back. "For years," he said, "I've watched you move through life like nothing touches you. Like everything is just a transaction." Richard didn't respond, because it was true. "And now," his father continued, "you bring strangers into this house and expect me to just accept it." "I'm not asking you to accept it," Richard said. "I'm telling you I'm not sending them away." That was it. The line had been drawn. His father stopped walking, turned back slowly. "You're making a decision," he said carefully, "that carries responsibility." "I know. And if this becomes complicated, if this affects our name, our business—" "It won't," Richard interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "Because I'm not doing this for the business." That hit harder than anything else. For the first time, Richard wasn't thinking like the man he had been raised to become. And his father could see it. The silence returned again. But now, it felt like something was shifting beneath it. Finally, his father let out a slow breath. "Very well," he said. Richard blinked slightly, not expecting that. "They can stay," his father continued. "For now." Richard didn't speak, didn't react. He just waited. "But understand this clearly," his father added, his voice steady again. "This is your responsibility, not mine. I understand. If anything happens, you handle it." "I will." His father studied him one last time, then gave a small nod. "Then we'll see where this leads." And just like that, the tension eased. Not completely, but enough. His father turned and walked away, disappearing down the hallway without another word. Richard stood there for a moment, letting it settle. He had expected resistance, anger, maybe even rejection. But instead, he had been given something else. A chance. And now, there was no turning back. Upstairs, a soft sound echoed faintly. Laughter. Small. Fragile. But real. Richard looked up toward the staircase. For a second, he just listened. That sound didn't belong in this house. Not the way things used to be. But somehow, it felt like it should have always been there. He started walking, slowly making his way upstairs. When he reached the door, he paused. Inside, Isabella sat on the edge of the bed, her feet not even touching the floor, her teddy bear resting in her lap. Luke stood near the window, looking out, but not really seeing anything. They both turned when the door opened. Richard stepped in. "Everything okay?" he asked. Luke nodded. "Yeah." Isabella smiled faintly. "The bed is really soft." Richard gave a small nod. "Good." A quiet moment passed. Then Luke spoke again. "Are we really allowed to stay here?" he asked. Not with disbelief this time, but with something deeper. Hope. Richard met his eyes. "Yes." Luke swallowed. "Even if our mom doesn't remember us?" The question landed heavy. Richard took a step closer. "She will," he said. Luke searched his face. "Are you sure?" Richard paused, just for a second. Then, "I believe she will." It wasn't a promise, but it was enough. Isabella looked down at her teddy bear, gently brushing its worn fabric. "I'm gonna take him to see her tomorrow," she said softly. "Maybe that will help her remember." Richard felt something tighten in his chest again. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Maybe it will." Outside, the night had fully settled in. And inside that room, 3 lives were slowly starting to intertwine in a way none of them fully understood yet. But somewhere, beneath all the fear, something else was growing. Something fragile. Something real. And none of them knew yet that the next day at the hospital would test that fragile hope in a way they weren't ready for. The night passed slower than any of them expected. In the large, quiet room, Isabella lay curled under the covers, her small hands wrapped tightly around her teddy bear. Even in sleep, her fingers didn't let go, like she was afraid everything else might disappear if she did. Luke stayed awake longer, sitting at the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, thinking about the house, about the road, about their mother, looking at them like strangers. He clenched his hands together, trying to hold himself steady. "We're gonna be okay," he whispered under his breath, more like a promise to himself than anything else. Across the hall, Richard stood by the window in his own room, the city lights glowing faintly in the distance. But his mind wasn't there. It kept going back to the hospital room, to Isabella's voice breaking, to Luke trying not to fall apart, to Patricia's empty eyes. He had spent years believing problems had solutions, that everything could be handled, managed, fixed. But this didn't follow rules. This didn't care about money or power. And for the first time, he felt the weight of something he couldn't control. Morning came quietly. Soft light filtered through the curtains, touching the room gently. Isabella was the first to wake. She sat up quickly, looking around like she needed to remind herself where she was. Then she remembered. "Luke," she whispered, nudging him. "We have to go see Mommy." Luke opened his eyes slowly. For a second, confusion passed over his face. Then reality settled back in. "Yeah," he said, sitting up. Isabella held up the teddy bear. "He's coming too." Luke gave a small nod. Downstairs, the house was already awake. The smell of breakfast filled the air, warm and unfamiliar. Richard stood near the table, watching as they came down the stairs. They looked different now. Cleaner. Rested. But still carrying the same weight in their eyes. "Morning," Richard said. "Good morning," Luke replied. Isabella gave a small wave. Richard gestured toward the table. "You should eat something before we go." They hesitated. The food looked like too much. Luke glanced at Isabella, then back at Richard. "Are we allowed to take this?" Isabella asked softly. Richard's chest tightened slightly. "Yeah," he said. "It's for you." They sat down slowly, carefully, like they were afraid to do something wrong. Isabella picked up a piece of toast, holding it gently. "Mom would like this," she said quietly. Luke swallowed. "She will," he said. "When we bring her back." Richard watched them. And something shifted again. Not just sympathy. Not just concern. Something deeper. Something that felt personal. They didn't eat much. Just enough. Then they stood up almost at the same time. "Can we go now?" Isabella asked. Richard nodded. "Yeah. Let's go." The drive felt longer this time. Not because of the distance, but because of what was waiting at the end of it. Isabella held the teddy bear close, whispering something to it under her breath. Luke sat straight, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes fixed ahead. Neither of them said much. And Richard didn't try to fill the silence. He understood it. The hospital came into view again. Same building. Same cold feeling. but today it carried more weight. They walked inside together, straight to the desk. "She's in the same room," the nurse said, recognizing them. Luke didn't wait. He started walking immediately. Isabella followed, holding onto him. Richard stayed just a step behind. The hallway felt tighter today, heavier, like every step mattered more. They reached the door. Luke stopped, just for a second. He looked down at Isabella. "Ready?" he asked. She nodded, gripping the teddy bear. Luke pushed the door open. Inside, Patricia was sitting up. Her color looked better, her eyes more focused, but her face, still searching, still unsure. "Mom," Luke said softly. Patricia turned her head. Her eyes landed on him. Then Isabella. And for a moment, nothing changed. The same distance, the same confusion. Isabella's grip tightened. But this time, she didn't cry. She stepped forward, slowly, holding the teddy bear in both hands. "You gave this to me," she said, her voice shaking but determined. "On my birthday. You said he would protect me when you couldn't." Patricia's eyes moved to the bear. Her expression shifted slightly. Something small, something barely there, but different. Patricia whispered. Isabella stepped closer, placing the teddy bear gently on her lap. "You used to fix his arm when it got loose," she continued. "And you said he's part of our family." The room went quiet. Luke held his breath. Richard didn't move. Patricia stared at the teddy bear. Her fingers slowly touched the worn fabric. And then, her hand froze. A flicker. A crack. Something breaking through. Her breathing changed. Her eyes widened just slightly. "I know this," she whispered. Isabella's eyes filled instantly. "Mom," she said, barely breathing. Patricia's hand trembled. Her gaze shifted from the teddy bear to Isabella's face. And for the first time, something deeper appeared. Not just feeling, not just instinct, something closer to memory. Tears filled her eyes. She tried again. But the words didn't come. Luke stepped forward now, his voice breaking. "Mom, please." Patricia looked at him, and her expression changed again. Stronger this time, like something inside her was fighting its way back. "I know you," she said slowly. The words hung in the air. Fragile, uncertain, but real. Isabella gasped. Luke's chest rose sharply. Richard stood frozen at the door, watching it happen. Watching something that couldn't be bought, couldn't be forced, couldn't be controlled. And just as hope began to rise, Patricia's expression suddenly twisted. Pain crossed her face. Her hand pressed against her head, and her voice dropped into a strained whisper. "Something's wrong." Patricia's hand pressed harder against her temple, her breathing uneven, her face tightening as if something inside her mind was pulling in two different directions. Luke stepped forward instantly. "Mom, what's happening?" I see something," she whispered, her voice shaking. "It's like pieces. They're there, but they don't stay." Isabella grabbed her hand. "It's okay, Mommy. We're right here." Patricia's eyes filled with tears. She looked at Isabella, then at Luke, then back down at the teddy bear resting in her lap. Her fingers tightened around it. And suddenly, her body stilled. Her breathing slowed. And something shifted. "I remember," she whispered. Luke froze. Isabella stopped moving. Richard didn't even breathe. "I remember the blue gate," Patricia said slowly, her voice gaining strength. "You, sitting outside, waiting." Her eyes lifted to Luke. You told your sister not to be afraid. Luke's lips trembled. Mom. Her gaze moved to Isabella. You were crying, holding this bear, asking me if everything was going to be okay. Isabella broke. Mommy, she cried, throwing herself forward. Patricia's arms opened instantly, wrapping around her with a strength that hadn't been there before. I remember, Patricia said, her voice breaking as tears streamed down her face. I remember everything. Luke stepped in next, unable to hold back anymore. He wrapped his arms around both of them, burying his face against her shoulder. For a moment, nothing else existed. Not the hospital. Not the fear. Not the pain of the day before. Just a family, finding each other again. Richard stood at the doorway, watching quietly. And something inside him settled. Not the way problems usually did. Not with control, but with understanding. After a while, Patricia pulled back slightly, her hands still holding her children close. I thought I lost you, she said, her voice trembling. I was in this dark place, and I couldn't find my way out. You didn't lose us, Luke said softly. We stayed, just like you told us. Isabella nodded quickly. We didn't leave. Not even for a second. Patricia closed her eyes, pressing her forehead gently against theirs. That's my brave children. Then slowly, she looked up. At Richard. Her expression changed. Gratitude. Deep, undeniable gratitude. You're the one who brought them here, she said. Richard shook his head slightly. I just gave them a ride. No, she said firmly. You gave them safety. You gave them time. You gave them a chance to stay together when everything else was falling apart. Richard didn't answer, because for the first time, he didn't know how to respond to something that wasn't about status or success, just meaning. Days passed, and slowly, everything began to shift. Patricia regained her strength. Her memory stayed. The doctors cleared her to leave. But one truth still remained. They had nowhere to go. The blue gate was still closed. The house was gone. The past couldn't be returned. Standing outside the hospital, Patricia looked at her children, then at Richard. I don't know what comes next, she said quietly. Richard reached into his pocket, then paused. For a moment, he looked at them. Really looked. At Luke, standing stronger now. At Isabella, still holding that teddy bear, but no longer afraid. At Patricia, holding everything together with nothing but love. And then he spoke. You don't go back, he said. Patricia frowned